Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast, episode 83. My name is Matt Wood, and today we're going to hear about Antoine and Delphin Delmas. They were father and son. Antoine was a pioneer grape importer in the Santa Clara Valley, bringing some of the first importations of varieties to the U.S. or California. Delphin was his son and much more focused on winemaking. There are a couple topics that we touch on briefly here, like the history of Zinfandel and the early New England to California viticulture connection, that we'll cover much more in depth at another time. We'll also touch on some unique early California stories and how San Jose differed from some of the other California cities. There are great firsthand accounts of some of the earliest mechanized winemaking in California, and a touch more of the California Wine Association also. A quick reminder that there's a Patreon at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast. The link is in the show notes also. Any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. Telling a friend is a great way to help out too. Here we go. Founded in 1777 as a secular settlement in conjunction with the Mission Santa Clara de Assisi, the Pueblo de San Jose de Guadalupe was not just the first pueblo, but also the first capital of the state during its early American years. The first vineyards planted by the Padres in Northern California were located here too. Post-secularization, the mission would supply stock for the earliest orchardists and vineyardists. Fruits, olives, vines, and grain spread out from the various mission locations. Word of the discovery of gold in California and dreams of riches, combined with the revolutions of 1848 and 1849 in Europe, would trigger one of the largest migrations in human history. San Jose and the surrounding Santa Clara Valley drew a huge amount of French immigrants in the years following the discovery of gold. Antoine Delmas from Bordeaux and thousands of other French settlers would come streaming into the valley. French immigrants represented one of the largest population groups, and more made their way to San Jose than any city except San Francisco. In those days, you had a couple choices of how to arrive in California from Europe. There was the 20,000-mile and 6-month journey on a ship sailing around Cape Horn, sailing through some of the deadliest ocean on Earth. Alternatively, you could sail to Panama and cross the isthmus on foot, horseback, or a combination of the two, through some of the deadliest jungle on Earth, before waiting for a ship to San Francisco that would hopefully arrive soon. We don't know how Antoine Delmas arrived, but he did, most likely in 1851. Like many of the first Argonauts, we think it was just him. The family stayed in France. It could be that his wife accompanied him on this journey, though. Delmas would found the French Gardens Nursery in San Jose, near today's Delmas Street. The land was purchased from the prominent Don Antonio Maria Señol as part of his Los Coches Rancho land grant. Over time, San Jose would earn the nickname the Garden City because of men like Delmas. We'll take a moment to talk about Señol here because he was a truly important figure in early California, almost like a Forrest Gump. Somehow he was involved with all of the prominent families and famous events. Señol was one of the largest landowners, and a true witness to history, as his biography is called, all throughout his life. He would be associated with the Californios, but his Catalan birth would place him at a slight remove from them. His father was an Afrocansado, those Spanish who at first had close ties and reverence to France from a language, art, fashion, and culture sense. Today, we might call him a Francophile. Later, it would be a pejorative, used to mark those who supported Napoleon's invasion of Spain. Señol, for his part, would serve in the French Navy, being on board the ship Medusa when it wrecked off the coast of Africa. The raft that carried nearly 150 shipmates of his would be memorialized in the famous painting. His first stop in California in 1817 was at Yerba Buena, as San Francisco was known. He and 3 other men, all seriously ill, were more or less left there by the French ship they were sailing on. Señol would regain his health at Mission San Francisco before traveling south to San Jose, becoming the first foreign settler in the Pueblo. His pure Spanish blood would allow him to ingratiate himself with the gente de razón, or people of reason, the top echelon of pre-United States Californio society. And his experience with French culture and language would give him a familiarity with the hordes of French immigrants that would eventually join him. He served as alcalde, or mayor of San Jose, on 2 separate occasions, and his mercantile and trading posts would put him at the center of the business world. Bargaining and bartering and a general business sense seemed to come naturally to him, something it was said most Californios lacked. Eventually, he would earn a commission from other settlers when he was able to secure better deals with trading vessels arriving in the bay. Californio-era California was a largely cashless society. Beef tallow, cow hides, wheat, alcohol, olives, and other crops were its currency. As a visitor to Sanol's ranch during the yearly cattle slaughter observed, quote, "Cash is not expected and not often demanded," unquote. By 1820, Sanol was distilling and selling liquor at his general store. This wasn't always looked upon kindly by the government. And by 1840, he had foreign and domestic wines for sale in his shop. Pierre, or Pedro Sansavan, depending on if you go with his given name or Californio name, was a son-in-law of Sanol. Pedro was seemingly all over the state before taking over his uncle's El Aliso vineyard and winery in Los Angeles. Sanol's business savvy served him well, and he would eventually own land that would later make up all of Pleasanton and Sanol, 2 of the 5 districts of Fremont, and the Willow Glen neighborhood of San Jose, an enormous amount of highly desirable land. His brother-in-law was Jose Maria Amador, who we heard about in the Jarvis episode. Sanol was already well off, but the 2 men were always up for an adventure. Together they arrived in the goldfields in July of 1848, when the mining was easy and before the wider world joined in, pulling out sometimes 10 pounds of gold a day between them and their Indian servants, who it seems like were paid based on accounts, but it's tough to confirm. Returning to San Jose, Sanol's general store would reopen, selling supplies at gold rush prices to the thousands entering the city. San Jose would become the first capital, though that would only last a couple years. By the time Antoine Delmas arrived, the hustle and bustle of arriving miners and those headed back home broke in, and the importance of being the capital city had dissipated. San Jose again became a sleepy and peaceful city. Sanol would have trouble managing his vast land holdings. Squatters would take over land they saw as empty or unwatched. Many of the other pre-United States settlers lost vast amounts of land in the same way. But some might say what goes around comes around, because much of this land had been taken originally from the Native American tribes by the missions and the Californios. Sanol would begin to sell portions of his land. Better to get some money than have it further picked away by squatters and in the courts. The General Henry Nagley, someone who we will get to in time, purchased his land even before Delmas. The Pellier and Portal families would arrive soon after, giving the city even more of a French accent. Joseph and Delphin Delmas would join their father and mother in San Jose soon enough. How they got here exactly is up for debate. It was said by the great wine historian Charles Sullivan that Francis Stock, a German storekeeper and nurseryman, would bring the 2 boys over when they were 9 and 11 years old. But I feel it's more likely that Pierre Pellier brought them here. Pierre and his brother Louis had already established themselves in San Jose when Pierre returned to France in 1854 to marry his fiancée, before returning to California. Both families had ties to the Bordeaux region and seemed to move in the same circles in California. The Pellier brothers had imported most of their grapes from the Charente, just north of Bordeaux, and I think it likely Antoine asked Pierre to bring his children to California on the way back. These French settlers would be more nurserymen and general farmer or gardener than they were winemakers for the most part. Nearly everything grew well in the Santa Clara Valley, they found. Grapes, plums, apricots, walnuts, peaches, strawberries, and wheat. The valley is sandwiched between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the more inland Diablo Range. The San Andreas, Hayward, and Calaveras Faults help create natural borders and the mainly alluvial soils of the valley. For the next 100 years, the fruit growing and packing and canning industries would grow until they were some of the largest in the world. Delmas would start at once, planting 14,000 mission vines and importing cuttings from his home country. This was the first documented importation of foreign grapes, in 1852. There is some dispute that Jean-Louis Vignes of Los Angeles' El Aliso vineyard had an earlier importation, but as far as I know, the only source is a remembrance decades later by William Heath Davis, and sometimes with a distant memory it's tough to pin down exact dates. If nothing else, this would be the very first in the northern part of the state. Delmas brought in Cabernet or Cabernet, Medoc, Folie Blanche, and Black Meunier. He would follow it up later with Charbonneau and most likely the first importation of Trousseau. Herasti and Delmas would both import Muscat of Alexandria. The Herasti importation coming from Malaga, Spain, and the Delmas one from France. Seems likely the Herasti importation was slightly earlier. The vinifera craze was off and running, though. Another large importations of vines from New England would be purchased the next year. This one likely supplied by his fellow San Jose gardener Bernard Fox. Before coming to California, Fox had been the foreman at the Hovey & Co. nursery in Boston, one of the largest and most well-known in an area full of nurseries. Fox and a few other men were sent west to deliver a large order and establish a nursery presence in California. He and his partners were accompanied by a large number of trees, vines, and other nursery stock. On the treacherous trip across the Isthmus of Panama, their botanist, Mr. Sheldon, died. Most of the stock they carried had been purchased by Commodore Stockton for his Potrero de San Jose rancho. It was located on the border of San Jose and what is now the city of Santa Clara. With this import, the Stockton Ranch nursery now had apples, apricots, pears, nectarines, peaches, and the first strawberries in the county. It doesn't seem like he ordered grapes, but Fox brought them, and after a year and a half in the West, started his own nursery. Fox was a fan of grapes in California, but wasn't focused on them. From his San Jose Valley nursery, that was the name of it, he would become at least as well known for his pears and palm trees as his grapevines. He was a hard-working, thrifty man, planting his own trees and doing his own budding in order to not be overextended, as so many other pioneers were. See the Jarvis episode for an example of that. I feel like we can take the names of Fox's nurseries as a stand-in for the man who ran this nursery the rest of his life. Straightforward, getting the point across, artless in the best way. Once writing, quote, "Time pressed so hard that we had to bud day and night," unquote. This was after he had received an especially large order of fruit trees. In this importation of Fox's, Delmas received a grape he would call Black St. Peter's. Let's pause that story for a moment to talk about New England viniculture of Vitis vinifera. We discussed some New England viticulture in the Kanai Nagasawa episode, but beyond the hybridizing taking place was another type of grape growing. This was in hothouses, or grown under glass as it might be called. The idea here came from Old England, and by forcing heat into these hothouses, grapes could ripen for the table in many of the off months. Gradually, about 2 weeks earlier every year, warm air from a stoked furnace would be pumped into the hothouses, waking up the vines. You might first start at the end of February for a June harvest, but within a few years you would be pumping heat in during December and getting ripe bunches of table grapes. This is only really a technique for table grapes by March. I happen to be writing this in March, and the high temperature of Salem and Boston, Massachusetts today are 42 and 47 degrees respectively. But in 1840, I could be eating fresh, ripe, local grapes. The process wasn't easy or cheap, and started off as a hobby for gentlemen farmers before growing into a full-blown fad. With time, it would fade out. This hothouse work predates the hybridizing we heard about in the Nagasawa episode. By the 1850s, new varieties like Concord that could be grown to scale and eaten fresh made into juice or wine, and could survive the harsh winters on their own, were becoming popular. More and more crosses and hybrids would come online, and the hothouses became a thing of the past. In New England, vinifera grapes would need to be grown under glass, but in Santa Clara Valley, the Valley of the Heart's Delight, they could be grown outdoors. That Black St. Peter's grape that Delmas brought in would be a great example. Grown as a table grape in New England, it would turn into one of the trademark grapes of California, then and now, Zinfandel. The grape had taken some twists and turns, though, before arriving. We'll run through it in much more detail in another episode. The shortest story for today is that George Gibbs of Long Island likely brought it to America from an Austrian Empire nursery. From there, it passed to prominent nurserymen in New England and New York like John Fiske Allen. We heard a bit about his hybridizing in the Nagasawa episode, and also William Prince, whose family's Long Island nursery was the highest quality and most well-known in the eastern United States. If you remember back to the episode on the Alhambra Valley, this was the golden age of pomology. Cuttings, seeds, starts, and the pests, viruses, and problems that went along with them were crossing the Atlantic and going each way across the country. New species and varieties spread throughout the world, but also phylloxera and potato blight and much more. Growers everywhere were experimenting with what would grow best in their local climate, often planting dozens of different pears, grapes, or roses in order to do so. Anthony P. Smith was the first to mention the grape by name in 1858. At the state fair that year, he exhibited Zinfandel, spelled Zinfandall. Smith was another New Englander who imported vines to California. Based near Sacramento, his pomological gardens were possibly the first commercial nursery in California, starting as early as 1849. He would be a source for much of the Zinfandel planted in the Sierra foothills. Unlike Fox, Smith would expend a fortune in expansion and be caught out once competition started up and demand dried up. Like I said, we'll take a deep dive into Zinfandel at some point. So back to Delmas. Calling it Black St. Peter's, Delmas would distribute the grape widely from his French gardens. The R.T. Pierce Vineyard in San Jose was one of the first to be supplied with cuttings from Delmas, and it was established in 1855. As these vines were going in, the Los Angeles area still dominated California viticulture, with over half of the planted acreage and gallons of wine. The San Francisco viticulture area, though, was first among the rest. This comprised Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, Alameda, Monterey, San Mateo, and San Francisco counties. Santa Clara was responsible for nearly a third of the planted acreage in this viticulture area. It was more than any other county in the state except Los Angeles County, which dwarfed it by 10 times the amount. Victor Fauré, the winemaker for California Mariano Vallejo, in 1856 would receive cuttings from Delmas to be planted in his boss's Lacrima Montes, or Tears of the Mountain vineyard. The Delmas importation soon spread to William McPherson Hill's vineyard. This Black St. Peter's was the first foreign wine grape in Sonoma. Within 10 years, though, there were clearly more importations of Zinfandel into Sonoma, and this time under the Zinfandel name. Some came from Joseph Osborne of Oak Knoll in Napa Valley via Frederick McCondry. He was a New England ship captain who also imported vines. William Hyatt in 1866 noted on his visit to Sonoma, quote, "The red table wines are made from the Mission grape, also from the Zinfandel, the Black St. Peter's, and a grape called Chagres Henneling, of which we have no particular history," unquote. I have no particular history with Chagres Henneling either, and I really have no idea at the moment what that Chagres Henneling grape could be. It doesn't seem to have any name in common with other grapes that would have been planted at the time, and Hyatt doesn't go into any further details, but still looking into it. As a founder of the Pioneer Horticultural Society, Delmas would help spread his knowledge to others. Horticultural societies were an important part of early wine-growing regions, and the San Jose chapter got an earlier start than most. The initial meeting took place under an oak tree at the ranch of Louis Provost. Today this is Live Oak Park on August 13th, 1853. From there they moved the meetings inside to the old City Hall building. Their monthly meetings were more open and inclusive than most, and women and friends were invited to attend. After discussions of what grew well or didn't, new discoveries and exhibitions, the flowers exhibited would be divided up amongst the women in attendance. We heard in the Jarvis episode how the idea spread over the hill and their Santa Cruz Area Society arose from seeing other important regions establish these horticulture groups. Much later on, in February of 1892, the California Horticultural Society would hold a pioneer meeting, inviting anyone who had been working in horticulture before 1865 to attend. The purpose was to set the record straight, establish timelines, and receive and record much of this early knowledge before the pioneers all passed away. So far, unfortunately, I've been unable to find any minutes or details about the meetings. The gardeners of San Jose. The San Jose nurserymen preferred to call themselves gardeners. Another horticultural group Delmas belonged to would also meet regularly, sometimes for education, sometimes for fun, like their 1855 party at San Jose's Hotel Bordeaux in honor of the patron saint of horticulture. All the locals were there, of course, and others like Pierre Saint-Savin came all the way from L.A., loaded with wines from the El Aliso winery. Others came with strawberries, pears, peaches, melons, grapes, of course, or whatever other fruits they had in season, making offerings of it to the saint. The mostly French crowd made a giant F and a giant A as decoration, and to show unity between the French and American sides. Toasts were given in English and translated to French so everyone could understand. During the evening, a glass bulb broke over Pierre Pellier's head. The burning gas fell and landed on top of his head. The two women on either side of him extinguished it with their handkerchiefs. He would wear a couple of unscorched handkerchiefs around his head the rest of the night as the party continued. Delmas passed out parting gifts of fruit to everyone at the end of the night. Quote, "For the folks back home," unquote. The California farmer, when visiting Delmas, had nothing but good things to say for his vineyard. Quote, "Great praise is due to Mr. Delmas for his very interesting and admirably located vineyard, the result of his own labor and efforts. It shows more attention to the vine-growing department than any other we visited. The arrangement is tasteful, the growth of the vines luxuriant, the fruit delicious, and its variety astonishing. The native wine exhibited to the committee gave evidence in superior skill of manufacture." Unquote. On another occasion, they called it the premium grape and wine garden of San Jose, and that, quote, "We think the vineyard of Mr. Delmas by far the best in the state. We do not speak of extent, but of character, order, and variety." Unquote. It was noted that in addition to the foreign grapes, he raised a large amount of the Los Angeles grape, which of course again they mean Mission. The awards came quickly. Delmas had chosen to graft over Mission vines to his new imports, so that by the time of the State Agricultural Society meeting in September of 1855, he had 10 foreign varieties to exhibit. They were, quote, "objects of general admiration," unquote. He would take home Best Exhibit of Foreign Grapes, and a special premium for vines of 2 years' growth, foreign. These cuttings had taken a long trip all the way around the Horn, packed tightly in their boxes for the 6-month voyage. It might have been the same importation or a latter one that he brought over the French snails. If you live in California and have ever seen a regular garden snail, you can thank Delmas for those. Jacques Pepin has a great story about his first interaction with these snails in Mendocino in his book The Apprentice. Despite not concentrating on winemaking, the white wine from Delmas in 1855 was described as, quote, "We find the white wine from A. Delmas a very good article and to resemble the better grade of wine grown on the Rhine," unquote. It would receive a second premium, and he was awarded $15. He also enjoyed his red, quote, "The red wine is also of an excellent quality, resembling closely the better grade of Bordeaux claret," unquote. He was thanked for both at the state fair, quote, "We return thanks as follows to Monsieur Delmas for his excellent collection of grapes and the bottles of wines," unquote. The 1856 agriculture show put on by the California State Agricultural Society was held in San Jose and gave those visiting and participating an opportunity to tour the grounds of many of the city's gardeners. Like others, they would praise the 10 acres Delmas had planted to vines. Quote, "The thrift and luxuriance of their growth afforded the best possible evidence that they could not have found a better soil or more genial climate," unquote. He was by now advertising over 80 varieties, calling it, quote, "the largest and most complete in the country," unquote. His main competition these years was A.P. Smith of Sacramento, John Froling of the soon-to-be powerhouse Kohler and Froling Winehouse, Matthew Keller of Los Angeles, who we learned about in his Don Mateo episode last year, Clement Colombe, who we heard about in the Fremont episode. His was a pioneer winery in the hills above Mission, San Jose, and Frederick McCondry. Vallejo and Harasti, Jacob Noth of Sacramento, Benjamin Wilson and the Sansoven brothers of LA would pop up here and there in the second half of the decade. All these producers would rotate, often winning first or second place and special premiums for their wines. Usually these were red or white wines, but sometimes Angelica too. Delmas would even win a prize for ladies' wine, which I have no idea what that is. It's the only reference I've ever seen to it. By 1857, he would be displaying a wide range of grapes at the Santa Clara Fruit Show. Here we go. This isn't all, but Muscat of Alexandria, Lacrima Christi, Black Pearly, Violet Chasselas, Fromatel, Black Cluster, Syrian, Black Malvasia, White Malvasia, Black Hamburg, St. Peter's, Rose Muscat, Cannon Hall Muscat, La Folle, White Corinth, Cabernet, Mossin, Medoc, Isabella, Muscat Frontignan, Malaga White, and Black Meunier. But as soon as later in the year, it seemed like he was slowing down on the nursery business. An auction held in December would offer for sale, quote, "The garden and nursery of Monsieur Delmas are well known as one of the best in the state, and it will be seen by our advertising columns that Monsieur Delmas will offer the principal portion of his stock at auction," unquote. Over 15,000 foreign vines of over 100 types would be sold, along with 10,000, quote, "California vines," or Mission, pears, apples, peaches, apricots, cherries, figs, and many more were for sale also. Delmas would exhibit a wine made from his Zinfandel at the 1859 State Fair, likely the first Zin to be entered, though still called Black St. Peter's. Charles Weber, just the next year, would put the first wine called Zinfandel up for judgment in the area. Weber will pop up again soon. Delmas's wine was from the 1858 vintage. The wine would earn a gold medal, as would the grapes it was made from. The committee's thoughts on that Zin, quote, "The best red wine that was exhibited was made by Mr. Delmas of San Jose, from foreign grapes. And although, as appears by his catalog, these grapes had been selected more as table fruit than for winemaking, yet the sample of wine exhibited by that gentleman only shows what could be done by a judicious selection of proper varieties," unquote. He won at the earlier second annual State Fair of the Horticultural Society as well. Quote, "A. Delmas of San Jose shows decidedly the best collection and largest number of varieties, all ripened to a high state of perfection," unquote. He was also awarded for foreign grapes, largest and best collection grown in open air, receiving a premium for his grapes and taking third in the fruits for the best display, embracing the largest collection of the best varieties. It's interesting to see that our New England ship captain, Frederick McCondry, was still winning awards. Actually, the only award given for grapes grown under glass. So it seems like that New England style of viticulture was at least being experimented with in California. Prizes were also being awarded for California grapes still. It's said Delmas had 105 varieties planted by now. Like most cases, when we've come across a huge number like this, only a very small portion are known to us. See the Matthew Keller episode where he claims an even larger number of varieties, but rarely goes into specifics. Delmas had around 350,000 vines in the ground representing those varieties. 2,000 rose bushes would have their own garden area. His importations wouldn't stop with grapes and snails. His introduction to the state of elemental sulfur, also in 1859, would better allow him and his fellow gardeners and vineyardists to fight powdery mildew. Around 1860, he would also bring in some of the first European winemaking and distilling equipment. His large, wheeled presses were able to process 12,000 gallons a day, a pretty fair amount for these early days of California winemaking. His partner in the venture, J.P. Leger, would return from a trip to France with the equipment. The two men wished it to be known that one was from Bordeaux, Delmas, and the other from Bourgogne, Leger. They would add some unspecified grapes from Bourgogne to Delmas's collection at this time. It seems at least some nursery activities continued, maybe on a smaller scale and not as a focus. Cuttings from his vineyard would be sold to Charles Lefranc of the Almaden vineyard. The two families would later become linked by marriage. H.W. Crabb of the Tokelon vineyard would purchase his so-called Crabb's Black Burgundy from Delmas, who had received it from the Pellier brothers, who imported it from the Charente. We went over some of the mystery and disagreement of this grape in the Nagasawa episode. Delmas's career as a nurseryman wouldn't be too long. He had chosen his location well, and the land was worth many times what he had purchased it for. Money that could be used to fund the education of his children. Some of his original 18 acres had already been taken for utility roads. His land backed up against the only bridge over the Guadalupe River. In the 60s, Delmas would gradually sell off lots, mostly to other French immigrants and mostly as summer homes. Roads would now intersect the gardens, everything divided up into blocks, but he still retained over 3,000 grapevines. A few lots in 1868 were sold to Auguste Portal, a likely relative of J.B.J. Portal, who pops up in episodes here and there. We know J.B.J. attended the first Bastille Day celebration in San Jose that was hosted by Auguste. After retirement, Delmas would rent a room from the Balzac family in town until his death in 1888. Antoine Delmas's gravestone was decorated with bunches of grapes in remembrance of his contributions. One son, Joseph Delmas, didn't involve himself with wine. It seems as though he was involved in the pork industry some and would exhibit and win prizes for his pork, hams, corned beef, and more. He'd also be the manager of the Dudfield Lumber Company and the president of the Garden City Cyclers, one of the premier cycling clubs of the city. Joseph's daughter would marry Henry Lefranc, the son of Charles of the Almaden winery. Delphin Delmas, or D.M. Delmas as it was often written, graduated from the Santa Clara College before attending Yale Law School. By the age of 25, he was the district attorney for San Jose. His fame would grow as a trial lawyer and public speaker and into a minor celebrity. A character based on him was featured in the book and film Ragtime. D.M. Delmas was one of the prominent legal minds of his day, owning his own building, the Paul Block on First Street in San Jose. It was named after his son. The 3,000 volumes of law books it contained was the largest in the state. His most famous case was the Harry Thaw trial, one of those trial of the century type vibes. Thaw had shot Sanford White, a designer of Madison Square Garden, on the rooftop of the building. It was during a performance with hundreds of witnesses around. This was a long-simmering feud over the former showgirl Evelyn Nesbit, who for years starting at the age of 15 was supported by White. Her mother was too. After a tumultuous relationship with White, Evelyn would go on to marry Thaw. Delmas would be Thaw's defense lawyer, spending time in New York while working on the case. He would impress the papers and lawyers there with his politeness and ease in getting his point across. They were surprised that such a good lawyer could come from the West. He managed to get an insanity plea from Thaw, keeping him from the death penalty but having the man confined to an asylum for the rest of his life. Perhaps his second most famous case and speech was a pro bono case for the Sempervirens Club in order to save the stands of remaining redwoods. A push to save the giant sequoias of California would piggyback onto his speech. As you might imagine, high-profile cases could be contentious. The papers were happy to dig into the personal life of Delmas. It seems they found a couple things, like his long-term mistress, and there was also the defendant that said she wouldn't want to kill him because he wouldn't suffer enough if she did that. Most of the time, Delmas was following in his father's footsteps. The Casa Delmas vineyard and winery near current-day Mountain View would become the largest independent winery in the valley during the 1880s. Its capacity was 500,000 gallons a year, and Delmas controlled 400 acres of vineyards. By 1880, he was offering table grapes for sale as Casa Delmas grew in size, along with JBJ Portal, Captain J.C. Merrithew, and the old Pierce vineyard that Antoine Delmas had helped to plant. On his 350 acres of wine grapes at Casa Delmas, he grew Zinfandel, Carignan, Chasselas, Charbonneau, and more. About 1,200 tons were processed here each vintage, and despite grape prices being low, the prices for the finished wines still held steady, especially in a premium area like the Santa Clara Valley. By the mid-80s, there would be nearly 10,000 acres of grapes in the county, 3/4 of them in wine grapes. There were even rumors Delphin would practice his speeches out amongst his grapevines at night. A new type of wine press appeared in the Casa Delmas cellars around this time. Worth's patented combined screw and toggle wine and cider press. Its 10-foot-long platform would run on wheels along a standard gauge railroad track. 2 baskets could be switched out so that one could be filled while the other was being pressed. According to the manufacturer, when its wheel was rotated, pressure would increase the same amount as the resistance to apply constant pressure to the must. And it was capable of pressures up to 300 pounds per square inch. Premiums were awarded at the Sonoma and Santa Clara Agricultural Fairs and the Mechanics Institute. Delmas wasn't the only producer to invest in this technology. Professor Hilgard, Edward Bale, the Cucamonga Vineyard, JBJ Portal, William Pfeffer, Joseph Drummond, Isaac de Turk, Fountain Grove, Paul O. Burns, J.L. Beard, and more would purchase this new Petaluma manufactured wine press. Philip Bargetto, after immigrating from Asti, Italy in 1887, would work at Casa Delmas for 12 years before founding the Bargetto Winery with his brother John in 1933. It's still one of the longest operating wineries in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Lackman and Jacoby would purchase wines from multiple growers in the Cupertino and Mountain View area in the pre-California Wine Association days. D.M. Delmas, along with fellow lawyer John Doyle and a Mr. Meyerholz, would sell a combined 130,000 gallons to them in 1890, and, quote, the highest market prices were paid, unquote. Delphin would play a role in the purchase of one of Napa Valley's most legendary wineries and buildings, Greystone. Today it's the home of the Culinary Institute of America. Previously, it's been a co-op winery and owned by the CWA, as well as the Christian Brothers. Its designer was the legendary Hamden McIntyre, who would also design Inglenook, Chateau Montelena, the Ewer and Atkinson winery that would become Beaulieu, Farniente, and more. The story goes that Charles Carpy and Jacob Jacoby of Lackman and Jacoby were bidding on the winery in 1894. When the bids were unsealed, the offer from each was the same. If these names are new to you, please check out the CWA series for more info about both men. A coin flip was suggested by Carpy. Jacoby won. As they both took the same train back to San Francisco's ferry building from St. Helena, a game of craps broke out. Carpy seems to have won the chance for Greystone in the process. Delphin, a friend of Carpy's, he would have known Jacoby well, too, used his eloquence to persuade Jacoby to give up the building. An alternate story is that Jacoby may have gotten cold feet and asked Carpy if he still wanted it. Carpy said yes, and Jacoby said take it. Despite being friends with Carpy, Delmas was in the middle of the wine wars and clearly sided with the California Winemakers Corporation and their fights against the CWA. As a founder and board member, he would help shape the direction under the early leadership of John Wheeler and P.C. Rossi, and the later leadership of Henry J. Crocker. A proposed meeting between Delmas and Percy Morgan of the CWA was the straw that broke the camel's back and led to the hostilities between the California Winemakers Corporation and the California Wine Association. Money was owed to the corporation by the association, who was refusing to pay unless an itemized list was provided. Delmas attempted to meet Morgan for lunch but was, quote, rudely refused, unquote, and told he would need to go to the CWA headquarters to see Morgan. It was suspected by the corporation that the CWA was refusing to pay in order to injure them financially. Delmas proposed a meeting at his law office, to which Morgan refused. Quote, so I informed Mr. Delmas by telephone, and in reply was told by someone in the office that my attitude would be regarded as a cessation of friendly relations and other proceedings would be taken. Unquote. Morgan was served papers in his office the next day. Morgan's reply, quote, the war has begun and will be carried out to the bitter end. Unquote. The oratory skills of Delmas were put to the test at the second session of the Winemakers Corporation. This is where he encouraged and urged members to stick together and move in harmony. He was a prominent member of the influential Santa Clara Valley winemen who approved Crocker's offer to purchase the entire crop for 7 years, starting with the 1899 harvest at $14 per ton. Delmas thought it was a very good offer, and it was more than he had been receiving for the last 7 or 8 years. The Sonoma growers had raised questions about the 22 bricks clause in the contract, meaning they would only get that $14 per ton if the grapes were sound, ripe, and at 22 bricks. Their question was whether some grapes at 19 and some at 23 or 24, but averaging out to 22 bricks would align with the contract. It landed on Delmas to ask the question. Crocker's response was that the contract did not limit him to pay more for some higher bricks grapes, and that he couldn't afford to stand at each vineyard checking sugar, and that the growers would have to be trusted to supply grapes aligning with the 22 bricks of the contract. The answer seemed to satisfy everyone. As we said earlier, Delmas knew much of the CWA leadership personally. Casa Delmas had even sold 250,000 gallons of wine in 1896 to the California Wine Association when everyone was on better terms. This was mostly 1895 vintage wine, and luckily we have one of the best illustrations of early industrialized and mechanized winemaking in California at Casa Delmas from novelist Frank Norris. Quote, at first sight, the making of wine on a California vineyard is a shock to one's preconceived notions of what winemaking should be like. It is a disillusioning, a disenchantment. The vineyard itself is disappointing. Miles and miles of low green bushes growing out of a hard, flat, dusty soil, where you expected to see perhaps trellises and dangling bunches and trailing vines growing against creamy white walls on a sunny hillside. Then, of course, nobody treads out the wine nowadays. You had some vague idea of a process of winemaking that was picturesque, but you're unwilling to see any poetry about temperatures and percentages and tannic acids and creams of tartar, unquote. Norris bemoans that this vintage wasn't a, quote, classic vintage where oxen turn the presser, unquote. He was disappointed that there was no foot treading, no dancing, no playing of instruments, no young men and women wearing grape leaves, no religious ceremonies or procession of peasants. This was, quote, a vintage of reality, a vintage of facts and figures, of chemical processes, a naturalistic vintage, unquote. Wagons would approach the winery loaded with grapes. Each was weighed before pulling forward for grapes to be pitchforked out onto a conveyor, carrying them upwards in a, quote, great perverse current running up a hill, unquote. The destemmer was at the top, and so was the crusher, the stems falling away into giant bins as the berries burst, the must running into the tank scattered throughout the facility after going through the, quote, gigantic beast, some sort of insatiable monster, gnashing the grapes to pulp with its iron jaws, vomiting them out again in thick and sticky clouds of must, unquote. It was loud in here, pistons and dynamos, pumps, engines, and it went on day and night during harvest. Norris describes the flowing juice under the incandescent lights at nighttime. Quote, bloodshot with drunkenness, but in the shadows, the wine looked otherwise. That is to say, it looked black, but in some way one saw at the same time that it was red, black and red simultaneously, as blood is black and red, unquote. Fermentations were all native, and Norris described standing over the tanks at Casa Delmas looking down as the CO2 hits and burns his nose. The fermentation bubbling, foaming, frothing, heaving like a, quote, miniature Vesuvius, unquote. After a few days, the free run was drawn off and pumped to smaller tanks to finish up its fermentation. The pomace was shoveled out into the hydraulic press, quote, very slowly, like some great, cruel, relentless tax gatherer, such as one has read about in the history of the Middle Ages. The last drop of blood is wrung from the fruit, unquote. Norris refers to this as the second wine, and it too was pumped to tanks. Like we heard about Winehaven in the CWA series, the pressed pomace would be turned into cream of tartar. But Delmas didn't do this himself. It was sold to a plant, resting in enormous tanks outside until it was time to ship. Norris is amazed that after all the pressing, this mass would begin to ferment again, and so would the pile of browning stems nearby, waiting to be used as fuel. The prune combine would take advantage of Delmas also. Their goal was to fix the price of prunes, selling them through one body via stock subscription system. It followed in the footsteps of the raisin producers, and Washington and Oregon were involved in it also. He would become president of the Pacific Coast Fruit Association as it came together. Over 75% of the growers in West Side, as Cupertino was called, and Mountain View would be subscribed. Delphin would have little more time after this to enjoy his vineyard. It was being ravaged by phylloxera, and in 1900, E.P. Bowden would pull 10,000 vines out of the ground for Delmas. The 504-acre ranch was sold to H.E. Lose in 1909. Mr. Lose and his brother farmed tree fruit, and they had the largest apricot orchard in the state, as well as other apricot, peach, and prune plum orchards. But cherries were their concentration. Crops that would become even more substantial in the Santa Clara Valley with time, before finally being overrun by tract homes, strip malls, and business offices, turning the Valley of the Heart's Delight into Silicon Valley. Many of us think of this as a post-World War II phenomenon, and it mostly was. But Elisha Stevens, an early settler of Cupertino and Mountain View, his party took the same path as the Donner Party a couple years earlier, left the area in 1862 for being too civilized. And by 1892, the changes were being easily noticed. Quote, grain fields have pushed back the pastures, fruit trees the grain fields, and now they are uprooting orchards to make room for residences, unquote. Delphin would move to Los Angeles and passed away at the age of 84 in 1928 in Santa Monica. His former vineyard land would turn into a large chunk of Sunnyvale. Drive around there and see how many things are named after cherries. Thanks for listening today. The Delmas story has always intrigued me. The Santa Clara Valley isn't primarily thought of as a grape-growing region, but it competed and sometimes surpassed Sonoma and Napa in quality until around Prohibition. This episode gives us some of the reasons why and shows how this valley evolved uniquely compared to others. I think the Seigneul story gives a great view into landholders between the Mission years and the American years. That California period. I'd love to know if his French background had anything to do with the amount of French settlers in the valley. I remember as a kid wondering what the deal was when we lived off of Bernal Road, and then moved 50 miles away only to live off of Bernal Road again. The answer was Seigneul and his connections with the Bernal family. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email IndieWinePodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast helps too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses like gas money, podcast hosting, research websites and books and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.